Science Beetle.
All right, so welcome back. The topic that I want to discuss with you today is the topic of variables. So what is a variable? And so I've already made a comment here at the very top, and let me go and say it this way. A variable is essentially a placeholder. And so I'm just going to go ahead and type this out for you. It's a placeholder that essentially points to a very specific area in memory. And so a variable is a placeholder and it points to a specific space. And what it's pointing to is going to be some of the data that you're actually trying to access, whether that be a numeric value or whether that be a character, single character, or whether it be a collection of characters known as a string. And so all that information is going to be stored in memory somewhere on the disk. If you want to access the value that is assigned to this variable, whether that be the numeric character or the string, you have to go to this specific address. It's kind of like when you want to talk to somebody. But what if you couldn't talk to anybody unless you actually went to see them in person? So the equivalent here would be for you to actually go to their specific location where they're at, maybe at their house, and then you would say, okay, well, I need to talk to so-and-so person. Let's say you wanted to talk to John Doe, for example, generic. Then you would go to John Doe's house, wherever they lived. At that specific address is where you would go. And when you get there, then you can have that conversation, if you will, with that individual, or you can have some kind of interaction with the value that has been assigned to that particular variable. So once you know what a variable is, the next thing for us to do is to kind of look at what are some examples of variables. And so examples include here, and I'm just going to do the following. I'm going to do this. Variable could be, for example, it could be X, it could be Y, it could be Z. It could also be other things, kind of like you can actually say, you can even call it variable. You can actually give it that name. Maybe that would be the designation. Instead of just saying X as the actual variable, you can actually give it the name variable. What you can do also is use a name that actually corresponds specifically to what the type of information that is contained by that variable or the assignment of that variable. You want to go ahead and give it that name so that people know exactly what you're doing. For example, let's say you're playing a game and you want to keep track of the score. You could give the variable a name of score. You could also give it, maybe you're keeping track of how many times someone shoots, so you could actually keep count of the shots. Or you can just call it count for shorthand. I would actually say that you want to use something a little bit more specific. So for example, if you're keeping track of the shots of basketball players' shots, you could actually keep, say, the variable name could actually be the count of shots. Now, I'm going to write this wrong. I wrote this wrong here because I want to make sure I explain something to you. Now, there are some rules that you need to utilize when you're naming variables. When you're giving names, it's not okay to include spaces like you see here. Like you see right here in this area here between the F and the S. This space is not okay. You don't want to include spaces in the name. And then not only that, but notice how I have lowercase letters all the way across. What is preferable here is that you use a system known as camel-case. And so camel-case here would mean that the first word in the name, if you have a compound word name, the first word is all lowercase, but the second word, you start off with a capital letter. So what I would do here is if I'm trying to keep track of count of the shots, maybe I would get rid of the of part and I would say count of shots. And so I could include a capital S and remove that. So I would say count shots. Or if I really wanted to keep count of shots, I would keep the capital O here and then count and say shots there, like that. But notice here the O, since it is the beginning of the second sequence, will have the capital letter, and that would be the example here of a camel case. There are other ways to do it as well. So for example, let's say that I wanted to have a variable that kept track of dollars earned. So I could say dollars, and then I would capitalize the second word earned, and that would be camel case there. Okay, so this are a couple of other examples that you can use in terms of naming your variables, or the names that you can use for a variable. There are some very specific rules that you need to follow. So let's take a look at those. Naming rules. Okay, so here's a couple of rules. The first rule is the variable name must begin with a letter. So it has to be a letter. The letter can be either lower or upper. It does not matter whether it's a lower or an upper, but if we're going to be using camel case, you want to make sure you use lower when using camel case. That's a very important thing that you want to do there. But whatever comes after that, all the other characters after the first one, can be anything. All other letters or all other characters can be a letter or a number or underscores. All of that is allowable. You can do all of that for the name. You do have a free reign as to put as many characters as you want, as many numbers as you want. So that's okay. Okay, so let's just make that a comment here. So it's essentially a limitless. And that means that you're just going to have a lot of free reign to put as many characters as you want there. When I say limitless, I don't mean like literally limitless. You just have a huge freedom to put as many characters as you want. But there is definitely a limit at some great length of the name. There is a limit to it. But for the vast majority of people who are keeping it reasonable, you virtually do have a large amount of flexibility in how many characters you can actually include. Things that you cannot do. So here is, I'm going to put this in alert. So alert. You cannot use the following. These are some of the keywords that you cannot use, and these are things that have been reserved because they are part of the logical side of things. So when we start talking about operators and how you navigate through making some conditional statements so that you can actually go through some logic building in your program, there's some keywords that cannot be used, and here's a couple of them. You cannot use is, you cannot use the word not, and you cannot use the word and. These three are off limits. You just cannot use them. Okay, so they cannot be included in any name because those are keywords that have been reserved by Python to be used in very specific circumstances and uses within the programming language as you begin to build your code. And then the other item you need to be aware of here, it's not much of a limitation, but it is something that you should be aware of, and that is that variable names are case sensitive. So you got to be very careful. So what does that mean? That means is because of the case sensitivity, you got to be very careful on whether you're using capital letters or lowercase letters in the names. And you have to be pretty consistent about it because any changes to the capitalization, either lower or upper, is going to cause a new variable to be created. And so when you have certain variable names that differ in case sensitivity of the letters you're using, those are essentially different names. And if you're referencing a name that has a capitalization in one version that you wrote and a different capitalization in a different version, that's going to cause a problem for you. So let me show you what I mean here very briefly. I'm going to go ahead and erase some of the code here and make some space for us, and I'll put this at the bottom. So when we talk about this, one common thing that happens is the following. So let's say I'm creating a variable. I'm going to create the variable cat here, lowercase. This is not the same as the word or the variable name capital C-A-T for cat, and this is definitely not the same as all caps C-A-T. Now you could go different variations and put the capital letters somewhere else, but these are just three simple examples of what I'm talking about. So you have to be very careful with that. So that's one thing definitely you want to make sure you keep in track of when you're creating your variable names.